NBC's Garrett Haake joins me now. Former aide to then Speakers John Boehner and Paul Ryan, and MSNBC political analyst Brendan Buck, and Jeremy Peters is back with me. Okay, Garrett, how is Donald Trump taking advantage of his second chance here with his picks?
Well, Trump has long understood that personnel was a problem for him in the first administration, which was essentially a shotgun marriage between his MAGA movement and the Republican Party. Now, 4 years after he left office the first time, the MAGA movement is the Republican Party. And so he's having, I think, a much easier time selecting people who both meet his resume requirements, as thin as his critics think those might be, and pass his loyalty tests, either with people that he's known from his entry into politics in 2015, 2016, to people who've campaigned with him and sort of joined him along the way, like Tulsi Gabbard or Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who have passed those kind of internal tests in Trump world. That is how he has filled out his cabinet selections in record time, and that's sort of the team he will be riding with between now and January or so, when their confirmation hearings start, which is really the challenge for him now, as these folks who are largely unvetted nationally before Trump picked them are getting the sort of full spectrum media vetting now in real time.
Yeah, thank you for that, Garrett. Obviously, Jeremy, he can put whoever he wants in certain positions that don't need confirmation. But anyway, he's got Kash Patel, Charles Kushner, another in-law, his daughter Tiffany's, Trump's father-in-law, he has appointed to a Middle East position, all in the family, right?
Right.
But does that signal to you, is there a general feeling that this is Donald Trump saying, I have a mandate, my mandate is to do what I said I would do, and frankly, the things he said out on the campaign trail are things that these folks can help him with?
Right. I think Donald Trump has always had a certain disdain for protocol and order, especially around Washington conventions. And so he just doesn't care. It's not that unusual for somebody for a friend of the campaign or the family in this case, to be appointed to something like the ambassador to France, right? That's not a very sensitive position. But some of these other picks, we'll have to see how far they get through the Senate. Well, I mean, the president is an ex-felon, so I don't think we should be too surprised. I mean, not an ex-felon. I'm sorry. He is a convicted felon. So that doesn't strike me as so out of the norm, at least when we're talking about Donald Trump.
Brendan, is Donald Trump putting Republicans in a difficult position with some of these picks? And would you expect that there could be some more fights coming up?
Yeah, certainly. Not necessarily the appointments you all were just talking about. And I'll remind everybody, Donald Trump had his daughter and son-in-law as White House staff the first time around. So it's not as though it was a completely traditional White House, even from the jump last time. But certainly the people who he's expecting to get Senate confirmed here are far beyond, or at least some of them, are far beyond the norm of what anybody would expect to have any type of easy confirmation. And I'd just like to caution people, while they are sort of shock and awe at the moment, and there's a lot of questions of whether some of these people can get through, it's still very early. We're going to learn a lot more about a lot of these people in this process. Obviously, with Pete Hegseth, we're learning more and more about his personal history. And so it's not necessarily like what is their, their background and qualifications. There's going to have to answer a lot of questions. People are going to have to sit in front of a Senate panel and talk about what their actual goals are. And of course, they can say whatever they want. But I think it's just important to realize that the process has not even really begun for a lot of these people. And there's going to be an added level of scrutiny that'll give a lot of people who aren't necessarily diehard Trump supporting senators opportunities to vote down a few of these. And I expect they will.
And Jeremy, you've done a lot of reporting on Steve Bannon. He's one of Trump's biggest supporters, biggest allies. He also has a big megaphone now that he's out of prison. He's back doing the War Room, right? His
Another
podcast.
felon, right?
Yeah, but he features a lot of these folks on his podcast, which is heard by millions. Is this not just about All in the Family, but MAGA synergy?
I think absolutely. I mean, Trump's motto after the last successful presidential run in 2016 was promises made, promises kept, right? And that was a very important motto for him to live up to because he needed re-election, right? He needed to honor his commitments to the religious right by naming the right Supreme Court justices and giving them the right
and
he did do that. This time he doesn't need to do that. So his payback seems to be those people who have stood behind him, who didn't abandon him, when he was politically toxic. And that's what we're seeing here. I think some of his biggest cheerleaders who, despite their sketchy checkered pasts, are being elevated to potentially, these tremendous positions of power. I think what they're doing is actually quite clever by putting so many of these people up who clearly are going to have issues getting through the Senate, who Republicans have said, hold on, wait a second, I don't know about this. I mean, I don't want to say it almost makes Matt Gaetz seem quaint, but certainly there's no way that the Senate is going to block all of these controversial picks. So they're going to have to pick one, two, just a very small number to really, really dig in on.
Brendan, we know that Trump has repeatedly, besides promises made, promises kept, and he has said, I'm going to keep my promises to you. He's also talked about retribution if given a second term, which he has been, obviously. I want to play what he said about this in 2023.
In 2016, I declared, I am your voice. Today, I add, I am your warrior. I am your justice. And for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution. I am your retribution. I will fire the unelected bureaucrats and shadow forces who have weaponized our justice system like it has never been weaponized before. It's sick. These are sick people.
Unelected people run this government. I mean, they keep it moving anyway, but that's a conversation for another time. Do you get a sense, Brendan, that Donald Trump would get congressional support from Republicans for retribution?
I certainly don't think you'd get a lot of pushback. Look, Donald Trump, it's one thing to kind of talk about whether it's Project 2025 or whatever sort of aggressive agenda people want to talk about. Donald Trump cares and looks at the whole world basically through himself. And I think it's important to appreciate that his agenda is only important so much as it makes him look good. And his agenda is only important to him as much as it satisfies his urgings. And so, of course, he's going to come in and say, the first thing we're going to do is go after the people who wronged me. And he can frame it as doing it on behalf of other people. But he's the most self-centered president we've ever had. That says a lot. His entire worldview is, are you with me or are you against me? And if you're against me, I'm coming after you. Now, what can he do on that in practice? There are real limitations, and I think some of the threat is a little bit overblown, but I don't think that he cares that much about solving problems for the American people. He sees this as his opportunity to change the narrative, change history, and frankly, make himself feel good. And at the end of the day, that may be all he cares about.